Good evening. Tonight we begin with a development that Pentagon officials had feared, dismissed, and ultimately prepared for. A move that unfolded not over weeks or months, but in just 48 hours. 48 hours that shifted the entire calculus of European security. 48 hours that forced NATO into its most significant mobilization since the height of the Cold War. 48 hours that left intelligence, analysts across multiple agencies, scrambling to understand what Vladimir Putin is really planning and what he might do next. What Moscow did this week crossed a line that Washington had desperately hoped would hold. A line that had been drawn in private diplomatic channels. A line that had been reinforced through back-channel communications. A line that, until 72 hours ago, the Kremlin appeared willing to respect. And when that line broke, the alliance did not hesitate. They responded with precision, unity, and unmistakable force. Tonight, we're going to walk you through exactly what happened, what it means, and why defense officials across 3 continents are describing this as one of the most dangerous moments in European security since the fall of the Berlin Wall. For months now, there had been signals not from official Kremlin statements, not from Russian state media broadcasts, not from diplomatic communiques, just signals that Vladimir Putin was preparing something unprecedented. Quiet movements, unusual repositioning, communications patterns that didn't match the established rhythms intelligence agencies had come to recognize. Russia has been aggressive, yes. That is nothing new. But they have been predictable in their aggression. Their moves have followed a certain rhythm, a pattern, almost a choreography that Western analysts had learned to read like a familiar script. Strike here, retreat there, provoke, deny, escalate in words, de-escalate in actions. It was dangerous, but it was understandable. But what set off alarm bells in Washington, in London, in Brussels, and in intelligence centers across the NATO alliance this week was that the pattern went silent. The choreography stopped. The rhythm broke. Intelligence analysts who monitor Russian military activity for a living, the people who spend every waking hour tracking satellite imagery, intercepting communications, analyzing troop movements, they know the indicators. They know what to look for. The movement of strategic assets from garrison positions. The repositioning of command and control. Structures to forward operating locations. The unusual communications patterns between military districts. The sudden cancellation of routine exercises. The unexplained furloughs for personnel in sensitive positions. All of that went quiet, simultaneously, across multiple military districts, without explanation. And whenever Moscow goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud, dangerously loud. Early Tuesday morning, approximately 3:47 a.m. Eastern Time, according to officials who have been briefed on the intelligence, satellite reconnaissance detected what analysts described as significant strategic force repositioning across Western Russia. This included nuclear-capable Iskander missile systems that had not been moved from their garrison positions in over 18 months. It included 2 NCI's strategic bombers being dispersed to secondary airfields, a classic Russian tactic for protecting high-value assets before anticipated conflict. It included submarine activity in the Northern Fleet that deviated sharply from established patrol patterns. These are not the kinds of assets that Russia moves casually. These are not the kinds of repositionings that happen by accident or bureaucratic confusion. These are the kinds of moves that Russia only makes when they are signaling something very specific: deterrence, escalation readiness, or preparation for offensive operations. Western intelligence didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all 3 at once. What they did know, what became immediately clear as the data came flooding in, was that Vladimir Putin was changing his strategic posture, dramatically, rapidly, and without any prior diplomatic signaling. And when a nuclear-armed power shifts its strategic posture without explanation, even by small increments, the Pentagon pays attention. When it happens suddenly across multiple domains, in ways that don't match any established pattern, the Pentagon does more than pay attention. It mobilizes. The alert issued by the Pentagon tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not the kind of measured, bureaucratic statement that gets released on a Friday afternoon to minimize media attention. It was urgent. It came with immediate effect. And it triggered response protocols that hadn't been activated in years. Senior defense officials speaking after emergency briefings at the Pentagon, at NATO headquarters in Brussels, and at SHAPE Supreme headquarters, Allied powers Europe described Russia's move in terms we rarely hear from military professionals who are trained to understate rather than alarm. They called it provocative. They called it destabilizing. And perhaps most importantly, they called it deliberate in ways that suggest a calculated strategy rather than mere posturing. One senior official, speaking on condition of anonymity, told CNN, "This isn't the usual Russian chest thumping. This is different. The pattern is different. The timing is different. And we are treating it with the seriousness it deserves." But here's the thing about provocation. It only works if the target hesitates. It only achieves its objective if the other side blinks, backs down, or gets tangled up in internal debate about how to respond. NATO did not hesitate. NATO did not blink. In fact, the alliance's response today was among the most coordinated, most decisive, and most rapid we have seen since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine began. Here's what we know. Within 6 hours of confirming the Russian repositioning, NATO activated its enhanced vigilance activity protocols. Within 12 hours, rapid response elements were being positioned across the eastern flank. Within 24 hours, additional air defense systems were operational, in positions they hadn't occupied in months. These weren't the standard readiness exercises that NATO conducts regularly for training purposes. These were full-scale mobilization orders, command structures, deployment authorities, and force postures that NATO only activates when they are preparing to defend alliance territory against an imminent or potential threat. Tonight, defense officials confirmed that Allied forces initiated enhanced forward presence operations across the entire eastern flank of the alliance. This includes Poland. This includes the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. This includes Romania. This includes the critical Black Sea region, where Russian aggression has been particularly acute. Air defense systems that had recently been placed on standby, waiting for exactly this kind of scenario, are now operational. Fighter aircraft from multiple NATO nations are now flying enhanced air policing missions. Their patrol patterns extended, their weapons loads configured for combat rather than training. Naval assets are repositioning to secure critical sea lanes in the Baltic and ensure freedom of navigation in waters that Russia has repeatedly attempted to dominate. NATO moved before Russia could consolidate their new positions. They moved before Moscow could establish facts on the ground. They moved before Putin's Gambit could achieve whatever objective he had in mind. In military terms, this is called getting inside the decision loop. It means acting faster than your adversary can react. It means taking initiative instead of surrendering it. Today, NATO did exactly that. They reinforced the Baltic states with additional ground forces. They activated quick reaction alert aircraft across 7 nations simultaneously. They deployed additional naval assets to secure the approaches to the Baltic Sea. They surged intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets to provide real-time awareness of Russian movements. In other words, the alliance targeted the strategic vulnerabilities Russia was trying to exploit. The gaps in coverage, the seams between national forces, the response times that Moscow hoped would be too slow. This is what made the Pentagon's warning so urgent. Russia's move wasn't just symbolic. It wasn't just political theater designed for domestic consumption. It was actionable. It represented the kind of positioning that could enable rapid escalation if left unchecked. It represented the kind of force disposition that could, under the wrong circumstances, support offensive operations. And NATO, understanding that fully, responded with force. Not recklessly, not impulsively, not in ways that could be characterized as aggressive or provocative, but strategically, proportionately, decisively. They didn't overreact with provocative counter moves that could escalate the situation. They didn't underreact with diplomatic statements alone while hoping the problem would resolve itself. They reinforced vulnerable positions. They demonstrated unified resolve. They showed Vladimir Putin and the world that the alliance remains ready. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Here's where we start to understand what may really be happening inside the Kremlin. Intelligence analysts now believe that Putin's latest move was designed specifically to test the cohesion of NATO after months of debate over continued support for Ukraine. Think about what's been happening in Western capitals. There have been questions about sustainability, questions about cost, questions about how long this level of support can continue. There have been political debates, some public, some private, about the trajectory of the conflict and whether diplomatic solutions should be pursued more aggressively. Putin watches all of this. His intelligence services report on every parliamentary debate, every newspaper editorial, every opinion poll that suggests even a hint of war weariness in Western publics. And he draws conclusions. Sometimes the right conclusions. Sometimes very, very wrong ones. This week, it appears Putin concluded that NATO might be fracturing, that the alliance might be divided, that a sudden, dramatic move might expose cracks in Western unity that could be exploited. He wanted to see whether the alliance would fragment under pressure, whether different capitals would respond differently, whether Washington and Berlin and Paris and London would spend crucial days arguing about what to do while Moscow consolidated its gains. But instead, the opposite happened. NATO didn't hesitate. NATO didn't fragment. NATO didn't convene endless consultations while the situation deteriorated. They issued a response that was so swift, so unified, so coordinated across multiple nations and multiple domains, that even the Kremlin noticed. You don't get Moscow's attention easily. They have become accustomed to Western deliberation, Western debate, Western process. But today, the alliance demonstrated something different. Today, NATO demonstrated that it can move fast when it needs to. Military strategists speaking with CNN under the condition of anonymity described Putin's shift as calculated brinkmanship, a way to probe Western resolve while maintaining plausible deniability. He wants to test us without committing to anything irreversible, one analyst explained. He wants to see how we respond so he can calibrate his next move. But NATO proved today that they remain both vigilant and prepared. Their deployments were not only rapid, they were coordinated, so precisely that assets from different nations, speaking different languages, operating different equipment, arrived at forward positions within the same operational window. That synchronization matters. It matters because it shows the alliance has been preparing for exactly this scenario. It matters because it demonstrates that NATO's command and control structures work under pressure. It matters because it shows Vladimir Putin that he is not facing a collection of individual nations. He is facing an alliance, a real alliance, an alliance that trains together, plans together, and responds together. It shows that NATO is not simply reacting to Russian moves after the fact. They are anticipating them. They are inside the decision loop. And that changes Putin's calculus in ways we are only beginning to understand. As reports continued coming in throughout the evening, we learned more about the scale and scope of NATO's response. American forces carried out rapid deployment exercises from bases in Germany, demonstrating the ability to reinforce Eastern Europe within hours rather than days. This forced Russian intelligence to reassess their entire picture of what the alliance is capable of. German and Polish units, operating under joint command structures that didn't exist 5 years ago, reinforced air defense coverage across gaps that had been identified in recent months. These aren't theoretical vulnerabilities anymore. They're being addressed in real time. British forces operating in the Baltic region reportedly enhanced protection of critical infrastructure, the communications nodes, the command centers, the logistics hubs that NATO relies on to coordinate eastern flank defense. French aircraft joined the enhanced air policing missions, a visible demonstration that this is not just an American or Eastern European response, but a whole alliance effort. Italian naval assets repositioned to support operations in the Eastern Mediterranean, ensuring Russia cannot exploit the distraction to advance its interests elsewhere. This wasn't just posturing. This wasn't just messaging. This wasn't just symbolic movements designed for press releases. This was strategic demonstration. This was unified deterrence in action. And deterrence, credible, visible, unmistakable deterrence, that is the one thing Vladimir Putin has struggled to break since this conflict began. For every gambit Moscow has made, NATO has countered with something that complicates Russian calculations further. For every attempt to divide the alliance has responded with greater unity. For every escalation, NATO has demonstrated that it can match and exceed whatever Russia puts on the table. Remember, Vladimir Putin thought the alliance would fracture over Ukraine. He thought this explicitly. Russian strategic planning was based on the assumption that Western unity would last weeks, maybe months, but certainly not years. He thought economic pressure, particularly energy costs, would divide European capitals from Washington. He thought European publics would tire of the costs and the sacrifices and the inconveniences. He thought that eventually, inevitably, the West would lose interest and move on to other priorities. This was not a minor miscalculation. This was the fundamental assumption underlying Russia's entire approach to this conflict. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. The alliance is more unified than it has been in decades. Countries that were skeptical of NATO's relevance are now its strongest advocates. European defense spending is at historic highs, with multiple nations exceeding the 2% of GDP target that was controversial just a few years ago. American commitment to Article 5, the sacred principle that an attack on one is an attack on all, has been reaffirmed repeatedly and emphatically by leaders of both parties. Sweden and Finland have joined the alliance, extending NATO's border with Russia by hundreds of miles and transforming the strategic geography of Northern Europe. Every single thing Putin expected to happen has not happened. Every single thing he expected wouldn't happen is happening. And tonight's response is just the latest demonstration of a pattern he should have recognized by now. What makes this moment so critical and so dangerous is that Putin's latest move happened at a time when he is under extraordinary pressure. Internal pressure. Pressure that doesn't get much attention in the West because Russia is so effective at suppressing internal dissent and controlling the information environment, but the pressure is real. Russian military hardliners, people who believe the special military operation has been too cautious, too limited, too constrained, and want more aggressive action. They want full mobilization. They want escalation. Pragmatists within the government, and they do exist, even if they rarely speak publicly, want a negotiated settlement before more damage is done to Russia's military capacity, its economy, and its international standing. Oligarchs want sanctions relief. They want access to their frozen assets. They want a return to the economic normalcy that allowed them to accumulate their fortunes. The Russian public, insofar as their opinions can be measured under conditions of intense propaganda and repression, wants the war to end without national humiliation. These are contradictory demands. They cannot all be satisfied. And Putin is attempting to balance them while managing a military campaign that has consistently, dramatically, almost comically underperformed expectations. When leaders in that position make sudden, dramatic moves, they're not doing it from a position of strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. They're doing it because they feel they have no other options. And that's what makes this moment so dangerous. Because leaders under pressure make mistakes. Leaders under pressure take risks they wouldn't normally take. Leaders under pressure can stumble into catastrophe while trying to escape a trap of their own making. The Pentagon's alert, now distributed to all 32 NATO member states through official channels, was designed to signal something very specific. It was designed to signal that Washington is not willing to allow Russian escalation to go unanswered. It was designed to signal that the alliance sees what Moscow is doing and understands its implications. It was designed to signal that any attempt to change the strategic balance through sudden moves will be met with immediate, proportionate, unified response. Defense officials said plainly, and I'm quoting directly here, that Russia's repositioning was inconsistent with the behavior expected of a responsible nuclear state. That is diplomatic language. That is the measured, careful language that officials use when they want to convey extreme seriousness, without being inflammatory, and in plain English it means this. This is unacceptable. We see what you're doing, and we are prepared to respond with everything we have. You don't usually hear that tone from the Pentagon. You don't usually hear that level of directness, unless something serious is at stake. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed his nation in a determined, defiant speech tonight, a speech that acknowledged the danger without surrendering to fear, a speech that rallied his people while reassuring his allies. He said, "We have seen these tactics before. We do not fear them. Every escalation by Russia has been met with the strength and unity of the Ukrainian people." He said, "Our partners understand what is at stake. This is not just about Ukraine. This is about the principles that underpin international order. The free world stands together because it understands what is at risk." And he said, "Every escalation by Moscow only strengthens our resolve and deepens our alliances. They think pressure breaks us. Instead, it forges us." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are not empty words designed for international audiences. These are statements from a nation and a leader that understands just how high the stakes have become, and that remains determined to prevail despite everything. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Putin's latest move wasn't isolated. It wasn't a single data point that could be dismissed as an anomaly or explained away as routine activity. It was part of a pattern. Along with the strategic force repositioning, Russian naval forces also increased activity in the Baltic Sea, with additional submarines putting to sea from northern fleet bases. Cyber operations intensified against European infrastructure targets, power grids, communications networks, financial systems, in what appears to be preparation for potential disruption operations. State media amplified nuclear rhetoric, with prominent commentators making explicit threats targeting NATO, decision-makers in European capitals. Diplomatic channels went quiet, with scheduled consultations being canceled or postponed without explanation. All of this happened within the same 72-hour period. That's not coincidence. That's coordination. When Moscow moves multiple pieces simultaneously, military, cyber, information, diplomatic, it means something larger is underway. It means the Kremlin is executing a plan, and understanding that plan, anticipating its next phases, and preparing appropriate responses is exactly what NATO is doing tonight. Analysts across multiple intelligence agencies are now considering several possibilities for what Putin is trying to achieve. One is that Russia is preparing for a major offensive push in Ukraine, perhaps a spring campaign designed to break the current stalemate before Western support can be reinforced. Another is that Moscow is attempting to fracture Western unity before a potential diplomatic initiative, creating pressure that makes negotiations seem more attractive to war-weary publics. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Putin is attempting to establish escalation dominance. Escalation dominance is a strategic concept. It means demonstrating that you're willing to take greater risks than your adversary, that you're willing to go further, push harder, accept costs they're not prepared to accept. If Putin can establish escalation dominance, he believes he can deter continued Western support for Ukraine. He believes he can make the alliance back down. He believes he can win without fighting by convincing his adversaries that fighting isn't worth the risk. But today, NATO took that card off the table. They didn't issue statements and wait to see what happens. They didn't convene endless consultations while the situation deteriorated. They didn't signal uncertainty, division, or hesitation. They mobilized. They demonstrated that escalation will be matched. They showed that the alliance is willing to accept the risks. And they sent a message that Vladimir Putin cannot have ignored. What we're watching now is a test of resolve, a test of unity, a test of everything NATO has built over the past 75 years. Putin wants to see whether the alliance's unity will crack under sustained pressure. Ukraine wants to show that Western support remains unwavering despite the costs. Washington wants to prevent escalation while maintaining credible deterrence. European capitals want to prevent the conflict from expanding beyond Ukraine's borders. And everyone wants to avoid the catastrophic outcomes that become possible when nuclear powers confront each other directly. These objectives are not entirely compatible. Managing them requires extraordinary skill, extraordinary coordination, and extraordinary resolve. Tonight, we're seeing whether the alliance is up to the challenge. So far, the answer appears to be yes. Tonight, we've heard from intelligence officials who are now monitoring Russian command and control channels around the clock. They say activity remains elevated but has not increased further since the initial repositioning. They say there are no immediate indications of imminent offensive operations beyond what's already happening in Ukraine. And they say Putin's decision to reposition strategic assets is likely part of a broader influence campaign intended to test Western responses and probe for weakness. But NATO is not backing down. In fact, the alliance is leaning forward. Additional reinforcements are being prepared. Readiness levels are being increased. Contingency plans are being reviewed and updated. The alliance's response today, rapid, unified, and proportionate, sent a message to Moscow that escalation will be met with determination, not fear. And it sent a message to the world that the post-Cold War security architecture remains intact. That alliances matter. That commitments mean something. That the free world will defend itself. As the week goes on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Vladimir Putin hoped to achieve with this dangerous gambit. We expect to learn more about Russian force dispositions. We expect to understand better what options Moscow is considering. We expect the intelligence picture to sharpen as analysts process the flood of information coming in from multiple sources. But what we do know, what is clear already, is that the Pentagon's alert was timely. It galvanized Allied coordination at exactly the moment coordination was needed. It demonstrated American leadership when leadership was essential. And it reinforced the credibility of NATO's deterrence posture in ways that will be measured in Moscow and understood. What happens next will depend on what Putin does in the next several days. If he de-escalates, if he pulls back the repositioned assets, resumes normal patterns, returns to established rhythms, this moment will be remembered as a successful demonstration of Allied resolve, a moment when the alliance was tested and did not flinch. If he pushes further, if he escalates rather than backing down, NATO has already shown they are ready. They have shown they are unified. They have shown they are prepared to respond. Section Q, final hook. And tonight, for the first time in weeks, the Kremlin appears to be recalculating. Russian state media, usually so quick to crow about Moscow's strength and Western weakness, has been notably subdued in its coverage of today's events. The Kremlin is quiet, too quiet. And when Vladimir Putin is quiet, it means he is thinking. It means he is assessing. It means he is choosing his next move carefully. Because tonight, the Russian president learned something he has been forced to learn repeatedly since this conflict began. The West is watching. The alliance is united. And NATO will not be intimidated. This story is far from over. The coming days will bring new developments, new challenges, new tests of resolve. But tonight, one thing is clear. Putin's gambit did not achieve what he intended. The alliance responded with strength, speed, and unity. And the message has been received in Moscow. Whether Putin heeds that message, whether he draws the right lessons or doubles down on a failing strategy, remains to be seen. But the alliance has done its part. It has demonstrated what it is capable of. It has shown the world what collective defense looks like in practice. And we will be here watching every detail, reporting every development, as the next phase of this dangerous confrontation unfolds. Thank you for watching.